I had another presentation prepared on this topic, but it really seemed very tepid and anemic as I was rehearsing it. Living through the events over the last several weeks compelled me to modify it, as times are more uncertain than they have ever been. You know, yes, we're in the midst of a global pandemic that it's taken over 100,000 American lives and almost 500,000 lives globally. We just were talking about that here a few minutes ago. And yes, we were in an economic crisis where the previous world systems, models, employment security, and traditional ways of interfacing have been turned on their heads. And yes, we're seeing our academic institutions reeling from the requirements of social distancing and what this will mean for the future of education. And yes, we're dealing with environmental changes, something that has kind of taken a back seat with everything going on that are impacting sea levels, weather patterns, global landmass, migration, as well as business operations. And yes, of course, being here in DC, we're seeing the political strife long on display, you know, reaching a crescendo during this frightening onslaught of conditions that is threatening our way of life. But nothing, I tell you, nothing screams uncertainty louder than us all watching in horror as George Floyd was senselessly murdered in the most demeaning and dehumanizing manner, with his face pressed into the street where people throw trash, spit, urinate, or worse, while continually begging for his life. So this injustice unleashed an extraordinary outcry around the world. It forced our nation to face that the reality of institutional racism is deep-seated and real. It ignited the call for a genuine, thorough, and all-encompassing examination of all aspects of our society that must lead to definitive and sustained change. So uncertain times, no doubt, and now more than ever, we need good leaders. So what does that mean, being a good leader? Who is a leader? What's the difference between leading during normal times and uncertain times? All questions I hope to be able to answer, at least touch upon during the rest of my presentation. So first, let's go back to the question of who is a leader. If leading is influencing others to achieve an end, then all of us are leaders. We all provide purpose, direction, and motivation as we go about our daily lives. We can influence our families, neighbors, communities, businesses, teams, governing bodies, really any entity that we are a part of. We can influence by our words or silently by our deeds. And now that's the what of leadership. And notice it's neutral. Influencing others can either be for good or for ill. And on the part of the influencer, it can be deliberate or inadvertent. So it's really important to understand that we are all leaders at some level to someone, if only ourselves. So providing purpose, direction, and motivation is what a leader must do. And it requires an understanding of his or her organization and the mission or task at hand in order to provide it. So there's a basic requirement to understand what the organization is for and stay grounded in that. And this is particularly important during uncertain times, as the buffeting current can cause a deviation from course as the organization runs to address this crisis or that. You know, your purpose can become blurred and the focus of those you lead may become scattered. And I can give you an example in my last job as the Army Surgeon General and the Commanding General of U.S. Army Medical Command. So I used to remind my team of over about 120 different, what we call military occupational specialties. And I can tell you that included things from physicians, nurses, dentists, veterinarians, pharmacists, radiology technicians, combat medics, logisticians, environmental science officers, researchers, helicopter pilots, believe it or not, and administrators, to name just a few. And I had to remind them that they all know what they do on a daily basis, of course, in their individual areas. But we must never forget what we are for collectively as an organization. And that was to ensure the medical readiness of our soldiers and to make sure that we as healthcare professionals were ready to deploy if necessary to support our Army. And every individual needed to understand how his or her job contributed to our mission. And it was up to me as a leader to ensure that they saw themselves as important to achieving it, and they saw themselves as valued members of my team. So next is what a leader must know, and this has several levels. I think a leader must know his or her people, and I mean really know them, not just as names on a roster, but who they really are. And this gets harder and harder as the organization gets larger. I mentioned MedCom earlier. We had over 140,000 soldiers, civilians, contractors, and volunteers. And clearly, I couldn't get to know all of them, but I made sure I got to know those that I could. And then I communicated to my leaders at the next echelon below that it was important for them to have that same knowledge of their people. That's what they had to know. And I made sure that I communicated my culture, intent, and how I expect people to be treated. So that trickled all the way down through the organization, and that's important. And that's what they had to know, and they knew that. You know, having mechanisms, multiple mechanisms to do that is really important. For me, I had, you know, at my level, I had 6 subordinate, you know, commands, major commands that were led by 1 or 2-star generals. And I made sure they understood my intent, and I kept communicating with them, and to make sure that they disseminated my message, you know, throughout, and not change my tone. That was always what I told them. I said, don't change my tone. You're hearing it from me, but by the time it gets to the 3rd or 4th echelon, then it can be changed. It's, you know, different the way I say it than, oh, you know, the boss wants you to do this. I don't know why, man, she makes me sick, but gosh, we got to do it. And so they change, you know, what the soldier, you know, or the civilian at the grassroots level see. And then getting out and circulating when I could, you know, so they could see me personally when I could. And finally, a comment on what leaders, on the B of leaders, is possessing or cultivating an attribute that I believe is the most important as a leader, and that's empathy. So making the effort to understand those you lead really goes a long way. It helps you genuinely treat people with dignity and respect. We hear that a lot, don't we? Dignity and respect, that kind of rolls off the tongue. Treat everyone with dignity and respect. And we should, definitely. But we need to really make sure that we internalize that and mean it. Do we really see people, every single human being, as having dignity as a person? Do we really respect them for who they are, no matter what they look like? So when we say dignity and respect, and when you say that as a leader, it's really important for you to understand that and mean it, not just say it. In the Army, I led an incredibly diverse organization, and not just by occupation or skill set. I kind of mentioned several of them before. I'm not going to go through all 120 of them for you, but we also had different personnel type. I had civilian, military, and then within the military, I had active component, reserve, and guard. And then I had contractors, and then I had Red Cross volunteers. So just personnel type, that diversity. But then I had diversity by race, gender, age, nationality, sexual orientation, and many others that I'm not mentioning here today, but are just as important. I made the effort to understand the very unique perspectives and challenges, strengths, motivators, and experiences of my team, so I could better lead them to accomplish our mission. It helped me remember that each person is unique, precious, and unrepeatable, and adds value by who they are. Their value is just by who they are, and then of course the skills that they bring to whatever their job is within the organization. So how do we tie this all together? When are we going to finally talk about leading through uncertainty? Well, if you know how to provide purpose, direction, and motivation to your team, and you do know and be what a leader must during times of tranquility, then you will know what to do during uncertain times, albeit with minor adjustments given the situation. But during uncertain times, you must be a leader of character, so your people know that they can trust you when you have to make the hard, unpopular choices, or ask them to do hard and unpopular things. And finally, remembering that while leading in any situation, your people remain your most valuable asset. They are the ones that will get the job done, and you must take care of them.